Welcome to Everyday Economics, a podcast that helps you to learn about the economic world happening around you every day. I'm your host, Chris Krug, president of the 501c3 nonprofit Franklin News Foundation. Everyday Economics is a production of America's Talking Network. You can check out all of our great podcasts at americastalking.com. To support podcasts such as Everyday Economics, please make your tax-deductible charitable contribution by clicking the link in the show description. We're recording this episode on Wednesday, January 4th, 2023, and joining me as always is my partner, Dr. Orphe Divounguy. He's a PhD economist. Dr. O, taking a look at the census data that came out at the end of 2022, an interesting report, but population in the United States over the last 3 years has been below norms. We typically grow at about 0.8% a year. 2022, we had growth of 0.4%, which is about half of normal, but that's twice as large as the year before and 20 times larger than 2020. So what is going on in terms of population in the United States, and how does that factor into anything related to our economics?
We have had this aging population, I want to say problem, for quite some time now. Our fertility rate is very low. People are not having as many children as they used to. And so, our population is aging. And what that really means is there's fewer workers coming up, right? So fewer potential workers entering the labor force compared to the number of people who are actually retiring, people who are leaving the workforce. And so, if you look at our labor force participation, that's one of the major constraints for the U.S. economy.
When I was out traveling around the world, and this is going back 6, 7, maybe even 8 years ago, I would have this conversation with people around the world unsolicited. They were very concerned. I mean, in countries and economies as broad ranging as China, where the one-child policy for years created this downward slide, an aging population and a downward slide with regard to births, but also in a country like Chile. And I'm sure a lot of other countries in the world where sort of the men and women both were favoring careers over parenting, pushing the parenting either back in their lives or just saying we're not going to have any children at all. Economically, what does that do to a country over time, and who's handling it better at this point?
I say this all the time. I mean, the economy is really a collection of people, right? And so, when you had a main problem is, we have this demand increase, but you don't have enough production, enough workers. You end up with these excess job openings that we've seen. And so that's a problem because, we know that if there are way more job openings than there are workers, the potential for, prices to increase and get out of control is there. And so, yes, I mean, we do have this problem where, we need more workers. We need more younger people coming into this country to fill jobs that are available now. I think that's a major issue. It's no coincidence that we've had, after the COVID shock, we had this acceleration, in demand via the low interest rates, the stimulus, and then not enough workers to fill jobs at the same time where net international migration had pretty much stalled.
The census data, I mean, obviously, in the headlines today, the crisis at the border, I mean, it could be reported on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week right now. I mean, based on what we're seeing, you're talking about millions of people that are entering the country. They don't factor into these statistics. Where do they show up ultimately in the labor force? We'll set aside the discussion about immigration policy for now. Where does this population who comes into the country without documentation, where do they show up in the labor force, and how are they accounted for in the population numbers per the U.S. Census?
That's a good question. I don't know if they're counted. I don't think most people coming into the country necessarily volunteer to answer the census questions. But in any case, and we have pretty good estimates of the population in the U.S. that is not documented. And when I say pretty good, I mean, I don't know if they're pretty good. I mean, we have some estimates.
Well, they're numbers, right?
That's right.
And they're fairly big numbers.
That's right.
I mean,
That's right. But ultimately, migration is what built this country. We all came from somewhere, at some point. I think we need more workers. If you talk to your friends, business owners, they all talk about a shortage of labor being a big driver. of their cost, of their issues. And so I think that's a big problem. Beyond the international migration, the census data also really reveals where people are moving across the country.
Let's talk about that if we could. I mean, it looks like the South really had a rock and roll year in 2022, and that would be defined really by like the Southeast.
Yeah, you have these states that basically reopened. They had fewer COVID restrictions. They reopened faster. And these states benefited from a large increase in housing demand and employment. Texas, Idaho, Florida, Arizona, Tennessee, huge beneficiaries.
In the South was the largest among those charted inside the U.S. I mean, it's 1.1% or 1.4 million. So that's positive net domestic migration and net international migration added together to get to that number.
Great example is Florida. Florida population increased. Most of the domestic migration, I think net migration in Florida was 1.01. So about 1 million additional people coming into the state of Florida in 2022. 1 million people. That's unbelievable. I mean, that's huge growth. That's huge growth. And so when you think about like what's happening here, people are moving to Florida with income, wealth. And you think about, okay, well, when you look at house prices in Florida, the Florida market has gotten very expensive, has seen a huge increase during the pandemic. And while most of the country is kind of slowing down in terms of, prices, I'm talking about house prices here. Florida markets, I was just looking at Tampa yesterday. Tampa house price growth has barely come down. In fact, I think, if you look at Zillow's forecast, Zillow forecasts that price in Tampa will actually increase next year. You look at these other markets that saw large price increases in the pandemic, and their forecast is to see somewhat of a price decline in 2023. So you got these Florida markets that are kind of outliers. It's just unbelievable. Population growth supports the housing and labor markets. Population growth supports spending in the area, supports the local economy. And so, yeah, it's important. It's important both from being able to receive people from abroad, but also from other states. And I think policy matters a lot. If you look at policy, some of the policies that are adopted in Florida, they're conducive to this stuff. People move for jobs and housing primarily, and then for retirement and to be close to families. This is the order: job, housing, retirement, and to be close to family. And so Florida provides all of that.
Put a fine point to it. The report itself, 30 seconds. What's it mean? We're growing again?
I think we're growing again. We're just not growing as much, and it might take a little while. I think we have to understand why people move, right? I said housing, job, housing, retirement, and close to family. Why do people come to the U.S., right? As a whole country, why is it that we have slow growth? Why do people come to you? They come to the U.S. for opportunity. If we have lots of jobs here, which, by the way, we have a ton of job openings, there's no reason people are not moving here unless there are restrictions to moving here. And I think the restrictions are on the policy side. It's very difficult for workers to come in the U.S. and stay in the U.S. And I think that hurts us. It's to our detriment.
For Orphe Divounguy, this has been Chris Krug. Subscribe to Everyday Economics and dozens of other quality podcasts at americastalking.com.
Are you looking for an interview podcast where you can be entertained and informed? Come check out our new podcast, America's Talking, to hear conversations with great stand-up comedians like Mark Normand.
Norm made you feel smarter than him, even though he was smarter than you.
As well as with leaders in the United States, like former Ambassador Andrew Bremberg.
I remember the fall of the evil empire. When the wall fell, every adult I saw was crying.
I'm your host, Austin Berg, and I want you to join the conversation on our new podcast, America's Talking, right now on Spotify.